In the grand halls of Alderia's royal palace, where centuries of secrets echo through marble corridors, one discovery would shatter the foundation of the monarchy forever. What began as a routine security sweep would uncover a web of betrayal so deep, it would force a prince to choose between family loyalty and the crown itself. Sometimes the greatest threats come from those closest to the throne. Prince Alexander of Alderia had always trusted his instincts, and tonight they were screaming that something was terribly wrong. The annual harvest gala was in full swing below, but he found himself drawn to the quiet solitude of his private study in the east wing of Valdres Palace. The weight of recent events pressed heavily on his shoulders as he poured himself a glass of aged whiskey from his grandfather's collection. The kingdom of Alderia had been through turbulent times lately. Political unrest in the northern provinces, economic challenges following the global recession, and mounting pressure from parliament for royal reforms had created an atmosphere of uncertainty. As heir to the throne, Alexander felt the burden of his future responsibilities more acutely than ever. His father, King Edmund, was aging rapidly, and many whispered that the crown prince would need to assume greater duties sooner than anticipated. Alexander moved to his mahogany desk, where classified intelligence reports awaited his review. As future king, he had been granted access to sensitive state matters, a responsibility he took seriously. However, as he reached for the leather-bound folder, his elbow knocked over a crystal paperweight, sending it crashing to the floor behind his desk. Cursing under his breath, Alexander knelt to retrieve the shattered pieces. The heavy desk had been a fixture in this room for decades, a gift from the people of Alderia to his great-grandfather. As he reached beneath it, his fingers brushed against something unexpected, a small, smooth object that definitely didn't belong there. His blood ran cold as he recognized the device. Years of security briefings had familiarized him with surveillance equipment, and this was unmistakably a sophisticated listening device. The tiny microphone was state-of-the-art, the kind used by intelligence agencies for long-term covert operations. Someone had been monitoring his private conversations, his confidential meetings, his most intimate moments in what he had believed to be the safest room in the kingdom. Alexander's mind raced as he carefully examined the device without disturbing its position. How long had it been there? Who had placed it? More importantly, who had been listening to everything he had discussed in this room over the past months? Strategic military decisions, diplomatic negotiations, family matters, all potentially compromised. The immediate suspects were obvious but painful to consider. Palace staff had access, but they were thoroughly vetted and many had served the royal family for generations. Foreign intelligence services were always a threat, but palace security was supposedly impenetrable. Then, there were the political opposition groups who had been growing bolder in their criticism of the monarchy. But, as Alexander sat back on his heels, holding the tiny device, a more disturbing possibility emerged. The placement of the microphone required intimate knowledge of his habits, his schedule, his preferred locations within the room. This wasn't the work of an outsider or a casual observer. This had to be someone with regular, unrestricted access to his private quarters. His stepmother, Queen Consort Isabella, immediately came to mind. She had married his father 5 years ago, following the death of Alexander's beloved mother. While the marriage had been presented as a love match, Alexander had always harbored suspicions about Isabella's motives. She was 20 years younger than King Edmund, beautiful, intelligent, and ambitious. Her family had significant business interests that could benefit from royal connections. Isabella had access to every part of the palace. She often entered Alexander's study to discuss state functions or family matters. She knew his routines, his meeting schedules, his private habits. Most importantly, she would have motive. As queen consort, her position was secure only as long as King Edmund lived. If Alexander ascended to the throne and married, his wife would become queen, and Isabella would be relegated to a lesser status. The sound of footsteps in the corridor outside snapped Alexander back to the present. He quickly photographed the device with his phone, ensuring he documented its exact position and appearance. The evidence would be crucial, but he needed to be careful about how he proceeded. If Isabella was indeed responsible, confronting her directly could be dangerous. She had already demonstrated her ability to infiltrate his most private spaces. Alexander's phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Isabella herself. "Darling, your father is looking for you. The Austrian ambassador has arrived and wishes to discuss the trade negotiations. Your presence is requested in the blue drawing room." The irony wasn't lost on him. If his suspicions were correct, Isabella might already know he had discovered the device. The timing of her message seemed too convenient, too perfectly orchestrated. Had there been another listening device he hadn't found? Was his phone compromised as well? Standing slowly, Alexander smoothed his formal attire and checked his appearance in the mirror. He couldn't afford to show any sign of distress or suspicion. Until he had a plan, he would need to play the part of the dutiful prince, the loving stepson, the unsuspecting target. The walk to the blue drawing room felt longer than usual. Every portrait of his ancestors seemed to watch him with knowing eyes, as if they understood the weight of the decision he was facing. The palace that had always been his sanctuary now felt like a maze of potential threats and hidden dangers. King Edmund was indeed waiting with the Austrian ambassador, but Alexander noticed how Isabella positioned herself near the conversation, close enough to overhear every word. Her smile was radiant, her manner perfectly gracious, but Alexander now saw her presence in a new light. How many of his diplomatic discussions had she been monitoring? How many state secrets had been compromised? The trade negotiations were complex, involving rare earth minerals that were crucial to Alderia's technological sector. As Alexander discussed import quotas and tariff structures with the ambassador, he was acutely aware that Isabella was absorbing every detail. If she was working with foreign interests, this information could be invaluable to Alderia's competitors. After the ambassador departed, King Edmund retired early, complaining of fatigue. Isabella lingered, approaching Alexander with apparent concern. "You seem tense tonight, darling," she said, her voice soft with manufactured sympathy. "Is everything all right? You know you can always talk to me about anything that's troubling you." Alexander studied her face, searching for any sign of deception or guilt. She was beautiful, certainly, with striking green eyes and an elegant bearing that had captivated his father. But, behind that beauty, was there a calculating intelligence working against the crown? "Just the usual pressures," Alexander replied carefully. "The northern provinces, the economic situation, preparation for my future role. Nothing I can't handle." Isabella placed a gentle hand on his arm, a gesture that once might have seemed supportive but now felt invasive. "Your father and I worry about you sometimes. You carry so much responsibility for someone so young. Perhaps you should consider taking a vacation, getting away from the palace for a while?" The suggestion sent alarm bells ringing in Alexander's mind. Was she trying to get him out of the palace? Did she need him gone for some planned operation? Or was she genuinely concerned, and he was allowing paranoia to cloud his judgment? "I appreciate the concern," he said, "but my duty is here. Especially with father's health concerns, I need to be available." Something flickered in Isabella's eyes. Disappointment? Frustration? It was gone too quickly to be certain, but it reinforced Alexander's growing suspicions. Later that evening, alone in his apartments, Alexander began a systematic search for additional surveillance devices. He found 2 more microphones, one in his bedroom, hidden behind a picture frame, and another in his private bathroom, concealed within the light fixture. The sophistication of the operation was staggering. Someone had been monitoring his most private moments for months, possibly years. The violation felt deeply personal, but Alexander forced himself to think strategically. If Isabella was responsible, she was playing a much larger game than simple eavesdropping. The intelligence gathered from these devices could be used for blackmail, manipulation, or worse, it could be sold to foreign powers interested in destabilizing Alderia's monarchy. Alexander spent the rest of the night researching Isabella's background more thoroughly than he ever had before. Her family's business empire had connections throughout Europe and Asia. Her late first husband had been a wealthy industrialist with ties to several governments. Her own education included time at elite institutions known for producing diplomatic and intelligence personnel. The more he learned, the more convinced he became that Isabella's marriage to his father had been strategic rather than romantic. She had positioned herself perfectly, trusted, beloved by the king, with unlimited access to state secrets and royal intelligence. If she was working for foreign interests, she was the perfect asset. As dawn broke over the palace grounds, Alexander made his decision. He couldn't confront Isabella directly without proof of her intentions. He couldn't involve palace security without risking that Isabella had compromised those systems as well. But he could set a trap. Alexander began planning an elaborate deception. He would feed false information through the compromised channels in his study, creating a fictional crisis that would force Isabella to reveal her true loyalties. If she was innocent, the false information would remain contained. If she was guilty, her handlers would react to intelligence that existed only in Alexander's carefully constructed lie. The plan would require perfect execution and enormous personal risk. If Isabella discovered his deception before he could gather proof, she might accelerate whatever endgame she had planned. Alexander would be placing not only his own life in danger, but potentially the stability of the entire kingdom. But, as heir to the throne of Alderia, he had sworn an oath to protect his people and preserve the crown. That oath demanded action, regardless of personal cost. The game of shadows had begun, and Alexander intended to win. The next morning arrived with typical palace routine, but, for Alexander, every interaction carried new weight. He observed the staff with fresh eyes, wondering who else might be compromised. The betrayal he suspected cut deeper than politics or international espionage. It struck at the heart of what family meant within the walls of Valdres Palace. Alexander's plan required careful preparation. He spent the early hours drafting a fictional intelligence report about a supposed security breach in the northern province of Corvania. According to his fabricated documents, separatist groups had allegedly discovered significant uranium deposits that could fund their independence movement. The report was detailed enough to seem legitimate but contained several subtle markers that would allow Alexander to trace its movement if it leaked. The fictional crisis was perfect bait. If Isabella was working with foreign interests, uranium deposits in a politically unstable region would be incredibly valuable intelligence. Any handler would demand immediate verification and action. Alexander's false report would force a response that would expose the entire network. Setting up his deception required using the very surveillance equipment that had violated his privacy. Alexander carefully staged a phone conversation in his study, knowing the hidden microphones would capture every word. He spoke to his fictional contact at the Ministry of Defense, discussing the uranium discovery with appropriate urgency and secrecy. "The geological surveys confirm it," Alexander said into his phone, his back turned to where he knew the microphone was hidden. "Enough weapons-grade material to change the balance of power in the region. We need to secure the site before the separatists realize what they're sitting on." He paused, listening to dial tone while pretending to receive instructions. "Yes, I understand. Complete secrecy until we can mobilize a response team. If word of this leaks to the international community, we'll lose control of the situation entirely." The performance was convincing, Alexander hoped. He mentioned specific coordinates, discussed tactical challenges, and even referenced which military units would be deployed. Every detail was carefully crafted to seem authentic while remaining completely false. After ending his fake conversation, Alexander placed the fabricated intelligence report in his desk drawer, making sure it would be visible to anyone searching his study. Then, he began the most difficult part of his plan, acting normally around Isabella while watching for any sign that she was communicating his false intelligence to outside parties. Breakfast with the royal family had always been Alexander's favorite time of day. King Edmund, despite his advancing age, retained his sharp wit during morning conversations. Isabella typically discussed her charitable obligations and social calendar. The atmosphere was usually warm and familial, but today Alexander struggled to maintain the illusion of normalcy. "You look tired, my dear," King Edmund observed, studying his son with paternal concern. "Are you getting enough rest?" The responsibilities of leadership require maintaining one's health. Isabella quickly joined the conversation. "I mentioned to Alexander last night that he should consider taking some time away from the palace. Perhaps a hunting trip to the estate in Moravian? The fresh air might do him good." Again, she was suggesting he leave the palace. Alexander's suspicions deepened, but he forced a smile. I appreciate the concern, but there are too many pressing matters right now. Perhaps after the situation in the northern provinces stabilizes. He watched Isabella's reaction carefully. Did her expression change when he mentioned the northern provinces? Was there a flicker of heightened interest? The situation in the north? King Edmund asked. I wasn't aware of any particular developments. Alexander had to be careful here. His father couldn't know about the fictional crisis, as that would complicate the trap he was setting. Just the usual political tensions. Nothing that requires your immediate attention, father. I'm monitoring the situation closely. Isabella sipped her coffee elegantly. It's wonderful how dedicated you are to staying informed about every corner of the kingdom. Your mother would be so proud of the man you've become. The mention of his deceased mother stung more than usual. If Isabella was indeed betraying the family, invoking his mother's memory felt particularly cruel. Alexander excused himself from breakfast earlier than usual, claiming he had urgent correspondence to review. Over the following days, Alexander implemented additional layers to his deception. He staged more phone conversations, created false meeting schedules, and even arranged for trusted staff members to deliver fake classified envelopes to his study. Each element of the fiction was designed to make the uranium discovery seem increasingly urgent and valuable. Meanwhile, he began his own surveillance operation. Using palace security resources that he hoped remained uncompromised, Alexander discreetly monitored Isabella's communications. He tracked her phone calls, noted her meeting schedules, and observed her interactions with staff and visitors. The first suspicious pattern emerged within 48 hours. Isabella had suddenly increased her correspondence with international contacts. She scheduled 3 previously unplanned meetings with individuals whose backgrounds Alexander's research revealed to be connected to foreign business interests. Most tellingly, she made several encrypted calls to numbers registered in countries known for aggressive intelligence operations. Alexander's heart sank as the evidence mounted. The woman his father loved, the woman who had helped heal King Edmund's heart after his first wife's death, appeared to be systematically betraying everything the royal family represented. The breakthrough came on the 4th day of Alexander's operation. Palace security, at his request, intercepted a coded message Isabella attempted to send through diplomatic channels. The encryption was sophisticated, but Alderian intelligence services had access to advanced decryption technology. The decoded message was devastating: northern uranium confirmed. Corvania coordinates 47.2843 degrees north, 19.6156 degrees east, separatist groups unaware. Alderian response team deploying within 72 hours. Recommend immediate satellite surveillance and potential preemptive action. Alexander stared at the decrypted text, his worst fears confirmed. Isabella had taken his fictional intelligence and transmitted it to unknown recipients as fact. The coordinates he had fabricated were now being treated as the location of genuine uranium deposits. Worse, she was recommending action that could destabilize an entire region based on his deliberately false information. But the message revealed something even more alarming. Isabella wasn't just passing along intelligence passively, she was actively recommending strategies that could harm Alderian interests. Her suggestion of preemptive action could lead to international incidents or even military conflicts. Armed with proof of Isabella's betrayal, Alexander faced his most difficult decision yet. Confronting her directly would alert her to his discovery and might allow her to escape or destroy additional evidence. Involving his father would devastate King Edmund, whose health was already fragile. But allowing Isabella to continue her activities could pose an existential threat to the kingdom. Alexander chose a middle path. He would gather more evidence while preparing to neutralize Isabella's operation entirely. Using his authority as heir to the throne, he quietly assembled a team of the most trusted palace security personnel, individuals whose loyalty to the crown was beyond question. His plan required perfect timing and absolute secrecy. Alexander would stage one final deception, this time designed to catch Isabella in the act of transmitting classified information. He would then have grounds for immediate arrest and interrogation, hopefully uncovering the full extent of her network. The trap was set for the following evening, during a state dinner honoring the visiting Prime Minister of Valencia. While the palace was focused on the formal reception, Alexander would create another fictional crisis, this one so sensitive that Isabella would be compelled to communicate it immediately to her handlers. As Alexander prepared for what might be the most important night of his life, he reflected on how drastically his world had changed. A week ago, his greatest concerns had been trade negotiations and provincial politics. Now he was planning the arrest of his stepmother for treason, armed with evidence that could destroy his father's happiness and shake the kingdom's foundation. The weight of leadership had never felt heavier, but Alexander knew he had no choice. The crown demanded sacrifice, even when that sacrifice meant betraying the trust of someone he had tried to love as a mother. Tomorrow night, the game of shadows would reach its conclusion, and Alexander would discover just how deep Isabella's betrayal truly ran. The palace continued its elegant routines around him, unaware that within 24 hours, everything would change forever. The state dinner for the Valencian Prime Minister was one of the most elaborate events of the social season. The great ballroom of Valdres Palace gleamed with crystal chandeliers and golden accents, while diplomats, nobles, and international dignitaries mingled in their finest attire. For Alexander, the grandeur felt surreal against the backdrop of the trap he was about to spring. Isabella looked radiant in a midnight blue gown, her emeralds catching the light as she moved gracefully through the crowd. King Edmund beamed with pride as he introduced his queen to various guests, completely unaware that his son was preparing to destroy their carefully constructed world. Alexander had spent the afternoon perfecting his final deception. This time, the fictional crisis involved alleged terrorist threats against Algerian embassies worldwide, supposedly uncovered through an intelligence breakthrough that would revolutionize international security cooperation. The stakes were high enough that any foreign intelligence service would demand immediate access to the information. As the formal dinner concluded and guests moved to the ballroom for dancing, Alexander executed his plan. He slipped away to his study, knowing Isabella would notice his absence from the celebration. Sure enough, within 20 minutes, he received a text from her asking if everything was all right. In his study, Alexander staged his most convincing performance yet. He placed an urgent call to a fictional contact at International Intelligence, speaking loudly enough for the hidden microphones to capture every word while appearing unaware he was being monitored. "The terrorist cell has been completely compromised," Alexander said, pacing as he spoke. "We have access to their entire communication network, their funding sources, their operational plans for the next 6 months. Every Algerian embassy worldwide is now effectively protected because we can anticipate their moves." He paused, pretending to listen to instructions. "Yes, I understand the international implications. If we share this intelligence with our allies, we essentially give them access to the same network. It could revolutionize counter-terrorism cooperation globally." Alexander discussed fictional technical details about the intelligence breakthrough, making sure to emphasize its unprecedented value. Any legitimate intelligence service would recognize this as potentially the most significant development in international security in decades. "The full briefing document is in my safe," Alexander continued. "I'll need to present it to Father and the Prime Minister tomorrow morning. This could change everything about how we approach international security cooperation." After ending his performance, Alexander immediately activated a hidden camera he had installed in his study earlier that day. If Isabella attempted to access his safe or search for the fictional briefing document, he would have video evidence of her espionage activities. Returning to the state dinner, Alexander found Isabella surrounded by international guests, charming them with her wit and grace. She smiled warmly when she saw him approach, but he noticed how quickly she excused herself from her current conversation. "There you are, darling," she said, taking his arm. "I was worried when you disappeared. Everything all right?" "Just some urgent correspondence that couldn't wait," Alexander replied, studying her face for any sign that she had already processed his fictional intelligence. "Nothing that should interfere with tonight's celebrations." Isabella's grip on his arm tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course. Though if something truly urgent has come up, you know I'm always here to help however I can." The offer felt loaded with meaning. Was she fishing for more information, or was he reading too much into normal stepfamily concern? The evening progressed with agonizing normalcy. Alexander danced with diplomats' daughters, discussed trade policies with foreign ministers, and played the part of the perfect crown prince while his mind raced with anticipation. Every time he glanced at Isabella, she seemed to be watching him with increased intensity. The break in routine came at precisely 11:30 p.m. Alexander's phone buzzed with an encrypted message from palace security. Subject has left the ballroom. Currently moving toward the east wing. Isabella was making her move. Alexander felt a surge of adrenaline mixed with profound sadness. Part of him had hoped his suspicions were wrong, that there would be an innocent explanation for everything he had discovered. But Isabella's behavior was confirming his worst fears. Alexander waited exactly 5 minutes before excusing himself from a conversation about agricultural exports. He moved through the palace corridors with practiced stealth, avoiding the main passages where he might encounter staff or guests. His destination was a hidden observation room adjacent to his study, a security feature built into the palace during more turbulent times in Alderian history. Through the concealed observation window, Alexander watched as Isabella used what appeared to be professional lockpicking tools to access his study. Her elegant gown and refined demeanor seemed incongruous with the criminal skills she was displaying. She moved with practiced efficiency, suggesting this was far from her first covert operation. Isabella went directly to Alexander's safe, producing a sophisticated electronic device that began cycling through potential combinations. The equipment was clearly military or intelligence grade, not something available to civilian criminals. Within minutes, she had the safe open and was photographing the fictional briefing documents Alexander had planted. But Isabella didn't stop there. She began a systematic search of Alexander's study, photographing correspondence, copying computer files, and examining personal items with clinical precision. Her transformation from loving stepmother to professional spy was complete and chilling. Alexander activated a silent alarm that would alert his carefully selected security team. Everything was now in motion for Isabella's arrest, but he needed to gather as much evidence as possible about her methods and potential accomplices. Through his hidden cameras, Alexander watched Isabella complete her intelligence gathering and carefully restore everything to its original position. Her operational security was impressive. If not for the elaborate trap he had set, her breach might never have been detected. Isabella was preparing to leave when she made a crucial mistake. Instead of returning directly to the state dinner, she moved to a window alcove in the east wing and produced a satellite communication device. Alexander watched as she transmitted the stolen information in real time, confirming that she was working with foreign handlers who demanded immediate intelligence updates. The transmission lasted less than 2 minutes, but it provided Alexander with the final evidence he needed. Isabella wasn't just gathering intelligence for future use, she was operating as an active asset for a foreign intelligence service, transmitting classified information directly from inside the royal palace. Alexander's security team moved with military precision. Led by Captain Morrison, the most trusted member of palace security, they surrounded the east wing while Isabella was still completing her transmission. There would be no escape, no opportunity to destroy evidence or alert her handlers to the compromise. The arrest itself was swift and professional. Isabella's shock appeared genuine when Captain Morrison and his team emerged from their concealment, though Alexander wondered if even that reaction was calculated performance. "Your Majesty," Captain Morrison said formally, "you are under arrest for espionage, treason against the Crown of Alderia, and violation of state security. You have the right to remain silent, though anything you say may be used as evidence in proceedings against you." Isabella's composure cracked for just a moment, and Alexander caught a glimpse of something cold and calculating beneath her refined exterior. But she recovered quickly, maintaining her dignity even as palace guards secured her hands behind her back. "I assume my stepson is responsible for this absurd accusation," Isabella said, her voice steady despite her circumstances. "Alexander, surely you don't believe I could be capable of what they're suggesting?" Alexander emerged from the shadows where he had been observing, his heart heavy with the responsibility of what he had set in motion. "The evidence speaks for itself, Isabella. The listening devices in my study, your unauthorized access to classified information, your real-time transmission to foreign handlers, it's all been documented. For the first time since her arrest, Isabella's mask slipped completely. The woman who had been playing the role of queen consort looked at Alexander with undisguised fury and something that might have been respect. "You're more clever than I gave you credit for," she said quietly.
"How long have you known?"
"Long enough to ensure you can't damage this kingdom any further," Alexander replied. "The only question now is how much damage you've already done, and who else is involved in your operation." As Captain Morrison's team escorted Isabella toward the secure holding area in the palace's lower levels, Alexander felt the weight of leadership settling more heavily on his shoulders. The immediate threat had been neutralized, but he now faced the challenge of explaining to his father that the woman Edmund loved was a foreign spy who had betrayed everything the royal family stood for. The state dinner continued in the ballroom above, the guests unaware that the kingdom's security had just been preserved through one of the most elaborate counterintelligence operations in Alderian history. But, for Alexander, the real work was just beginning. He had caught one spy, but Isabella's sophisticated operation suggested a much larger network that would need to be dismantled. As dawn approached, Alexander prepared himself for the most difficult conversation of his life, telling his father that his queen was a traitor who would likely spend the rest of her life in prison for her crimes against the crown. The dawn following Isabella's arrest brought no relief to Alexander. While the immediate threat had been neutralized, the full scope of the crisis was only beginning to unfold. As he prepared to face his father with news that would shatter King Edmund's world, Alexander reflected on how quickly his life had transformed from routine royal duties to a complex web of espionage and betrayal. Captain Morrison's preliminary interrogation had revealed disturbing information about Isabella's operation. She had been recruited years before her marriage to King Edmund, making their entire relationship a carefully orchestrated deception. Her handler was a high-ranking official in the Varakian intelligence service, Alderia's primary geopolitical rival. The sophistication of her mission suggested state-level planning and resources. Alexander found his father in the private royal chapel, where King Edmund often retreated during times of stress or contemplation. The elderly monarch knelt before the altar, his shoulders bent with age and worry. Approaching him felt like walking toward an execution. "Father," Alexander said softly, "we need to speak privately." King Edmund rose slowly, his movements reflecting both physical frailty and emotional exhaustion. The celebration from the previous evening had drained him more than usual, and Alexander's serious tone immediately put him on alert. "What's troubling you, my son?" "Your message said it was urgent and classified." Alexander had spent hours preparing for this moment, but no amount of planning could make the words easier to speak. "Father, Isabella has been arrested for espionage against the crown. She's been operating as a foreign agent, likely since before your marriage." The color drained from King Edmund's face as if Alexander had struck him physically. The elderly king reached for a nearby chair, his legs suddenly unsteady. "That's impossible," Edmund whispered. "Isabella loves this family, loves me. She's devoted her life to serving Alderia." Alexander gently helped his father sit down, then knelt beside him. "I wish it weren't true, father. But we have irrefutable evidence. Surveillance equipment hidden throughout the palace, classified documents stolen and transmitted to foreign handlers, sophisticated intelligence-gathering operations conducted from within our own home." King Edmund's hands trembled as he processed the information. "How long have you known? How long have you suspected?" "I discovered the first surveillance device 3 days ago, purely by accident. Once I realized what we were dealing with, I had to gather evidence carefully. If Isabella had become aware of our suspicions, she might have destroyed crucial intelligence or escaped entirely." The king's expression shifted from shock to something approaching anger. "You investigated my wife for 3 days without telling me? You allowed me to continue living with someone you believed was a spy." Alexander had anticipated this reaction, but it still stung. "Father, I needed proof before making such a serious accusation. And, frankly, I wasn't certain you would be able to maintain normal behavior around Isabella if you knew what we suspected. Your safety depended on her believing her cover remained intact." Edmund stood abruptly, pacing to the chapel window.
What kind of information was she after? What did she gain access to? Everything, Alexander said simply. Military planning, diplomatic correspondence, economic strategies, intelligence operations. She had unrestricted access to state secrets for years. We're still assessing the full scope of what was compromised. The implications hit King Edmund like successive waves. The trade negotiations with Valentia, our military modernization program, the Northern Provinces Development Plan, she was involved in all of it. We believe she was specifically targeting information that would benefit Vocarian interests while undermining our strategic position. Her marriage to you wasn't coincidental, it was the perfect cover for a long-term intelligence operation. King Edmund turned back to his son, and Alexander saw tears in the elderly monarch's eyes. 5 years, Alexander. 5 years of marriage, of thinking I had found love again after your mother died. Was any of it real? Alexander had no answer that wouldn't cause additional pain. I don't know, father. Isabella was trained to be convincing, to create emotional connections that would support her mission. But, even if some feelings were genuine, her primary loyalty was always to Wallachia. The king slumped back into his chair, looking older than Alexander had ever seen him. What happens now? How do we handle this without destroying the monarchy's reputation? Alexander had been grappling with the same question. We need to conduct a full security review, identify anyone else who might be compromised. Isabella didn't operate alone, someone helped her access the palace, provided her equipment, maintained communication with her handlers. There's likely an entire network that needs to be dismantled. And Isabella herself? She'll face trial for treason, espionage, and violation of state security laws. The evidence is overwhelming. She'll likely spend the rest of her life in prison, assuming Wallachia doesn't attempt some kind of prisoner exchange. King Edmund closed his eyes, the weight of betrayal and responsibility crushing down on him. I brought an enemy into our home. I gave her access to everything we're sworn to protect. How many people will die because of my blindness? Alexander knelt beside his father again. You couldn't have known. Isabella was a professional, trained specifically for this kind of operation. Even our best security analysts were deceived. But, you weren't, Edmund said, looking at his son with a mixture of pride and sadness. You discovered the truth when everyone else, including me, was blind to it. Only by accident, Alexander insisted. If I hadn't knocked over that paperweight, we might never have discovered her surveillance network. Over the following hours, Alexander briefed his father on the full scope of Isabella's operation. The listening devices throughout the palace, the sophisticated communication equipment, the coded transmissions to foreign handlers, it painted a picture of a highly professional intelligence operation that had been operating under their noses for years. The most devastating revelation came from Isabella's preliminary interrogation. She had been specifically instructed to gather intelligence about King Edmund's health, succession planning, and Alexander's preparation for eventual leadership. Wallachia wasn't just interested in current Alderian policies, they were planning strategies to influence or destabilize the kingdom during the transition of power. They were preparing for your death, Alexander told his father bluntly. Isabella was supposed to gather intelligence that would help Wallachia exploit the instability of a new monarch taking power. King Edmund's face hardened with anger for the first time since learning of Isabella's betrayal. They used my grief, my loneliness after your mother's death, as a weapon against our people. Alexander nodded grimly. It's exactly the kind of long-term strategic thinking that makes Wallachia so dangerous. They don't just want to win today's conflicts, they're planning to dominate tomorrow's political landscape. The conversation was interrupted by Captain Morrison, who arrived with updates from Isabella's interrogation. The news was both encouraging and troubling. Your Majesty, Your Highness, Morrison said formally. The subject has provided significant intelligence about her operation, though we believe she's withholding crucial information about her network within the palace. What has she revealed? Alexander asked. She confirms she's been operating for the Wallachian intelligence service since before her marriage to King Edmund. Her primary objective was long-term intelligence gathering, but
she was also tasked with identifying potential assets among palace staff and court officials.
King Edmund looked up sharply. She was recruiting other spies? Attempting to, sir.
She identified several individuals she believed could be compromised through blackmail, financial pressure, or ideological persuasion.
However, she claims no successful recruitments were made. Alexander wasn't convinced.
She has every reason to lie about accomplices.
If there are other assets in the palace, revealing them would compromise ongoing operations. Morrison nodded.
We're conducting comprehensive background investigations on everyone Isabella had regular contact with.
The process will take time, but we'll identify any security risks. As evening approached, Alexander found himself facing a new reality.
The woman he had tried to accept as a stepmother was a foreign agent who had systematically betrayed his family and kingdom. His father was devastated, his trust in people fundamentally shaken.
The palace that had always been a sanctuary now felt vulnerable and violated. But Alexander also felt a growing sense of determination. Isabella's capture was only the beginning.
He would need to rebuild palace security from the ground up, identify and eliminate any remaining threats, and prepare for whatever retaliation Varakia might attempt. The Game of Shadows had revealed its first major secret, but Alexander suspected much darker revelations lay ahead. The crown's survival would depend on his ability to navigate threats he was only beginning to understand. 3 weeks after Isabella's arrest, the full scope of her espionage operation had been revealed through intensive investigation and interrogation. The damage to Alderian national security was staggering, but Alexander had managed to turn the crisis into an opportunity to strengthen the kingdom's defenses and restore his father's confidence in their ability to protect the realm. The investigation had uncovered a sophisticated network that extended far beyond Isabella's individual activities. 2 palace staff members had been providing her with information in exchange for money to pay gambling debts. A junior diplomat in the foreign ministry had been compromised through blackmail involving his private life. Most disturbing of all, a senior military advisor had been feeding strategic information to Isabella, believing he was helping to prevent war through unofficial diplomatic channels.
Alexander had personally overseen each arrest, ensuring that the full extent of Varakian infiltration was eliminated.
The process had been methodical and decisive, demonstrating leadership qualities that impressed both his father and the broader court. King Edmund, initially devastated by Isabella's betrayal, had watched his son handle the crisis with growing pride and confidence.
The interrogations had revealed that Varakia's ultimate goal was to manipulate Alderian succession planning.
Isabella had been instructed to gather intelligence about Alexander's weaknesses, his political views, his potential vulnerabilities as a future monarch. The information was intended to help Varakia influence or destabilize his eventual reign. They underestimated both of us, King Edmund said during one of their private briefings. They assumed I was too old and trusting to be suspicious, and they assumed you were too young and inexperienced to be a threat.
Alexander had used those assumptions against their enemies.
Working with Captain Morrison and a carefully selected team of security specialists, he had fed false information through Isabella's network for the final 2 weeks of her operation. Varakia now possessed detailed but completely fictional intelligence about Alderian military capabilities, diplomatic strategies, and economic policies. The counterintelligence operation had been brilliantly executed.
Varakian forces had repositioned assets based on false information about Alderian troop movements.
Their diplomatic corps had prepared negotiating strategies based on fictional Alderian economic weaknesses. Most satisfying of all, they had invested significant resources investigating the non-existent uranium deposits Alexander had invented during his initial deception.
Isabella herself had proven to be a more complex figure than Alexander initially understood.
During her final interrogation, she had displayed what appeared to be genuine remorse about the emotional manipulation involved in her mission. I never intended for King Edmund to fall in love with me, she had said, her composed facade finally cracking. My orders were to marry him for access, but his feelings became complicated.
Alexander had pressed her on this point. Are you saying you developed actual feelings for my father?
I'm saying that deceiving someone who genuinely loves you is harder than my training prepared me for, Isabella replied.
Your father is a good man who deserved better than what I gave him. Whether this admission represented genuine emotion or sophisticated psychological manipulation remained unclear, but it had provided Alexander with insights he would use in future counterintelligence operations. The most dangerous spies weren't those who felt nothing, they were those who could maintain their missions despite developing real human connections. The public announcement of Isabella's arrest had been carefully managed to minimize damage to the monarchy's reputation while maximizing the political advantage of exposing Varakian espionage. Alexander had worked with the kingdom's best communications specialists to craft a narrative that portrayed the royal family as vigilant defenders of national security rather than victims of foreign deception. The story released to the press emphasized Alexander's detective work in uncovering the plot, King Edmund's decisive action in authorizing the investigation, and the effectiveness of Alderian security services in protecting state secrets. Public reaction had been overwhelmingly supportive, with many citizens expressing admiration for the royal family's handling of the crisis. International response had been even more favorable. Allied nations had praised Alderia's counterintelligence capabilities and offered increased cooperation in future security matters. Several countries had requested briefings on Alexander's methods, recognizing the sophistication of his approach to exposing long-term espionage operations. Varakia's official response had been predictably defensive, denying any connection to Isabella and claiming she had acted independently. However, intelligence intercepts suggested significant concern within Varakian leadership about what other operations might have been compromised by Alexander's investigation. King Edmund had emerged from the crisis with renewed energy and purpose. Instead of being diminished by his personal betrayal, he had been invigorated by his son's decisive leadership and the kingdom's successful response to foreign threats. "You've shown me that the crown will be in capable hands," Edmund told Alexander during one of their evening walks through the palace gardens. "I've been worried about the transition of power, about whether you were ready for the full responsibilities of leadership. This crisis has answered those questions definitively." Alexander appreciated his father's confidence, but he remained acutely aware of how much he still needed to learn. The Isabella operation had revealed vulnerabilities in palace security, gaps in intelligence gathering, and weaknesses in personnel vetting that would require years to fully address. The most important lesson had been about the nature of modern threats to monarchical stability. Traditional enemies were easy to identify and counter. But sophisticated intelligence operations that targeted personal relationships and exploited emotional vulnerabilities represented a new category of challenge that required different defensive strategies. Alexander had begun implementing comprehensive reforms to palace security, personnel management, and intelligence operations. Every staff member would undergo enhanced background investigations. All sensitive areas would be equipped with advanced surveillance detection equipment. Most importantly, a new culture of security awareness would be established throughout the royal household. The reforms extended beyond physical security to include psychological preparation for the unique challenges of royal life. Alexander recognized that future threats might target his own relationships, his eventual marriage, his children's vulnerabilities. The crown required not just political and diplomatic skills, but sophisticated understanding of how personal life intersected with national security. 6 months after Isabella's arrest and imprisonment, Alexander received intelligence that Varakia was preparing a new operation targeting Alderian interests. This time, they appeared to be focusing on economic espionage rather than political intelligence, suggesting they had learned from their previous failure. The information came through established intelligence channels rather than dramatic palace discoveries, indicating that Alexander's reforms were working. The kingdom now had professional capabilities to detect and counter foreign operations before they could penetrate sensitive areas. Alexander felt confident that Alderia was stronger than it had been before Isabella's betrayal. The crisis had tested the monarchy's resilience and demonstrated its ability to adapt to modern security challenges. More importantly, it had prepared him for the complex responsibilities of future leadership. As he stood in his renovated study, now equipped with state-of-the-art security systems, Alexander reflected on how much had changed since that evening when a fallen paperweight had revealed a hidden microphone. The game of shadows continued, but now he was playing from a position of strength and knowledge rather than vulnerability and naivety. The crown had survived its test, and Alexander was ready for whatever challenges lay ahead in his journey toward becoming king of Alderia. The palace that had once been violated by foreign enemies was now a fortress of security and wisdom, protected by hard-earned experience and unshakable determination to preserve the realm against all threats. Isabella remained in prison, her life a cautionary tale about the consequences of betraying a crown that had learned to defend itself with both traditional honor and modern sophistication. The kingdom was secure, the royal family was stronger, and the future was bright with promise and protected by vigilance.